The sun was setting over the park, casting long shadows over families laughing, kids chasing frisbees, and joggers lost in their routines. In the middle of it all, a man sat on a bench, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, taking a rare moment to breathe. He had just wrapped up a grueling week at work, a week filled with high-stakes investigations and painstaking attention to detail. He was an agent of the FBI, though his calm demeanor gave no indication of the weight his badge carried. But today, he wasn't here for a mission. He was simply trying to enjoy a quiet moment in his own skin. That was when everything changed. "Hey," a gruff voice barked. The sharp tone pierced through the hum of the park, and heads turned. A police officer, towering and rigid, marched toward the man on the bench. His hand rested menacingly on his belt, close to his holstered weapon. "You're loitering," the officer said, his voice dripping with condescension. The man looked up, confusion etched across his face. "Loitering? I'm just sitting here. Is that a problem?" "It is when you do it," the officer shot back, his emphasis loaded with venom. "Let me see your ID." "For what reason?" the man asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. "For what reason?" The officer stepped closer, his presence towering and oppressive. "You don't belong here. That's reason enough." The man exhaled slowly. He'd seen this play out before, countless times, with people who looked like him. But never in his life had he expected to be on the receiving end of such baseless aggression. He reached for his wallet, carefully and deliberately, knowing any sudden move could escalate the situation. He handed over his ID, watching the officer's face twist into a sneer. "You think you're some big shot, huh?" the officer said, barely glancing at the ID before shoving it back. "I don't care what you do. You've got no business in this neighborhood." "I live in this neighborhood," the man replied. "And unless I've broken the law, I don't see why you're harassing me." The word harassing hit a nerve. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing the man by his arm and yanking him to his feet. "Harassing?" the officer spat. "You think you can talk to me like that? Who do you think you are?" Before the man could respond, the officer's fist connected with his jaw. The force of the blow sent him staggering back, a collective gasp rippling through the park as onlookers froze in shock. A mother pulled her child closer. A jogger stopped mid-stride, his mouth hanging open. Phones came out, recording the scene. The man straightened, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with a fire the officer failed to notice. "You have no idea what you just did." "Oh, I know exactly what I did," the officer snarled. "You people think you can walk around here like you own the place. Not on my watch." The man shook his head, his silence speaking volumes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small but unmistakable. A badge. An FBI badge. The color drained from the officer's face. He stumbled back half a step, his bravado wavering. You can't be serious," the officer stammered. "Serious enough to make one call and end your career," the man said coldly. "But I think I'll take it further." The officer's arrogance crumbled in an instant. The same man he'd just humiliated now held the power to destroy him. And he knew it. But the story doesn't end there. What comes next is a journey of justice, resilience, and transformation, a battle to expose not just one man's prejudice, but a broken system that allowed it to thrive. What will happen when the tables turn and the hunter becomes the hunted? How will the officer face the consequences of his actions? And how will this moment reshape not only their lives but an entire community's perspective on justice? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers and everyone who has faced prejudice, we see you, we support you, and we are committed to amplifying voices that matter. This channel is a space for stories of justice, resilience, and transformation, and we believe in using storytelling to inspire change. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one are just the beginning. Now, sit back and enjoy the ride, this one is for you. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Greenfield Park, a sprawling haven nestled in the heart of a suburban neighborhood. The park was alive with activity, children's laughter spilled from the playground, joggers paced rhythmically along the trails, and families picnicked on checkered blankets. It was the kind of scene that made you forget, for a moment, about the injustices that existed just outside its serene borders. On a quiet bench near the edge of the park, a man named Malcolm Gaines sat with his elbows on his knees, his sharp eyes surveying the scene. Malcolm wasn't a man who often found time for reflection, but today he'd carved out a moment for himself. A towering figure with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, Malcolm wore his tailored navy suit as though it were armor. His leather briefcase rested at his feet, a silent testament to the career he'd built with grit and determination. Malcolm was a special agent for the FBI, a title he carried with pride but not without its weight. Raised in the South Side of Chicago by a single mother, he'd spent his life proving people wrong, teachers who doubted him, peers who underestimated him, and a society that often seemed ready to pigeonhole him. But Malcolm wasn't bitter, he was determined. His work had taken him from small-town corruption cases to high-profile investigations, and he'd built a reputation as one of the most methodical, sharp-minded agents in the Bureau. Yet for all his accomplishments, Malcolm wasn't immune to the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders of the world's prejudices. He'd learned to steel himself against judgmental glances and assumptions about his competence, but no amount of preparation could fully shield him from the sting of being reduced to his skin color. Across the park, Officer Carl Mason was finishing his patrol. Carl was everything Malcolm was not: brash, short-tempered, and prone to overstepping his authority. Carl had been with the Greenfield Police Department for nearly a decade, but his tenure had been marked with complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, and general misconduct were frequent whispers among his colleagues, but nothing had ever stuck. He was good at skating just below the threshold of accountability. Carl had grown up in Greenfield, a predominantly white suburb, and prided himself on being a protector of order. His idea of order, however, often meant using his badge as a weapon to remind people like Malcolm that they didn't belong. As he walked the park, scanning for anything, or anyone, that seemed out of place, his gaze landed on Malcolm. Carl's lips curled into a sneer. A black man in a suit, sitting alone, with an expensive briefcase. To Carl, it was suspicious enough. Malcolm didn't notice Carl at first. His mind was elsewhere, drifting between the weight of his latest case and the small joys of watching the park's tranquility unfold. His daughter, Simone, would have loved this place. Malcolm rarely had time to bring her to parks like this since his divorce. Moments like these were bittersweet, reminders of what his career had cost him. Carl's voice shattered the calm. "Hey, you," he barked, approaching the bench. His uniform was crisp, his aviator sunglasses reflecting Malcolm's image back at him. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm looked up, surprised. "Excuse me?" "I said, what are you doing here?" Carl repeated, his hand resting on his belt. Malcolm frowned but kept his tone measured. "I'm sitting." "Is that against the law?" Carl stepped closer, his presence deliberately invasive. "It is when you're loitering." "Let me see some ID." Malcolm straightened, his calm exterior masking a storm brewing beneath. "Loitering? I've been here for all of 15 minutes. "Doesn't matter," Carl shot back. "Show me your ID or I'll assume you've got something to hide." Malcolm exhaled, reaching for his wallet slowly. He'd been here before, in different forms, in different places, but it never got easier. He handed over his driver's license, his jaw tightening as Carl snatched it from his hand. Carl barely looked at the license before thrusting it back. "What's in the briefcase?" Malcolm's patience was wearing thin. "It's personal. And unless I'm under arrest, you don't have the right to ask. Carl's face hardened. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by someone he perceived as beneath him. You want to make this difficult, he snapped. Because I can. The tension was palpable. Passers-by were starting to slow, their curiosity piqued by the escalating scene. Malcolm felt their stares, their silent judgments, and the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. "Officer," Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm, "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not a threat." "So, unless you have a legitimate reason," Carl cut him off with a shove. "You think you're smart? Think you can talk circles around me?" His hand tightened around Malcolm's arm, yanking him to his feet. "Let go of me," Malcolm said, his voice rising. "Make me," Carl growled. The shove came next, followed by the punch that sent Malcolm staggering back. The world seemed to pause. Conversations died, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Malcolm straightened slowly, his cheek stinging, his pride bruised. His hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Reacting with anger wouldn't help, not here, not now. He locked eyes with Carl, his gaze unyielding. "You have no idea what you just did," he said quietly. Carl scoffed. "You people think you're untouchable. Not in my town." Malcolm said nothing. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for the badge that could end this man's career. He didn't pull it out, not yet. The time would come, but not here, not now. Because Malcolm knew that justice wasn't about rage or revenge. It was about patience. It was about striking at the right moment, when the weight of the truth would be too heavy to ignore. The onlookers whispered among themselves, their phones discreetly recording the encounter. Carl's face was red with anger, but he hadn't yet realized the storm he'd just unleashed on his own life. Leaving you to wonder, how will Malcolm turn the tables? How will Carl face the consequences of his actions? And how far will Malcolm go to ensure justice is served? The park buzzed with murmurs and hushed whispers as the crowd began to grow. The moment had drawn an audience, their smartphones discreetly aimed, capturing every word, every gesture. Malcolm Gaines stood tall, his suit now slightly wrinkled, his jaw set with a mixture of restraint and fury. Across from him, Officer Carl Mason loomed, the aggressor still reveling in his fleeting sense of power, unaware of the storm brewing in front of him. "Are you going to explain why you're harassing me, officer?" Malcolm asked, his voice measured but cutting. "Or should I assume this is how you treat anyone who doesn't look like they belong in your park?" Carl's lips curled into a smirk. "Watch your tone," he said, jabbing a finger into Malcolm's chest. "You're the one who's out of line here. People like you always think you can run your mouth and get away with it. People like me." Malcolm's eyebrows lifted, his composure unshaken despite the rising tension. "Clarify that for me. What exactly do you mean by, people like me?" Carl hesitated, his bravado flickering for just a moment before he doubled down. "You know exactly what I mean. Always pushing boundaries, thinking the rules don't apply to you." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "The only boundary being pushed here, Officer Mason, is the one where you're overstepping your authority. And if you think that badge on your chest gives you the right to bully and assault people without cause, you're mistaken." Carl's face darkened. The quiet resolve in Malcolm's tone unsettled him, though he refused to admit it. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out, trying to regain the upper hand. "I don't need a reason to keep this park safe," Carl said, his words laced with arrogance. "Especially from someone who looks like they might be up to no good." Malcolm took a slow breath, steadying himself. The crowd was inching closer now, their cameras still rolling. Malcolm could see their faces, some curious, some appalled, others wary of getting too involved. He knew he had to tread carefully, not just for himself, but for the greater implications of this moment. "Officer Mason," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm, "you should think very carefully about your next move. Because every second you continue this is being documented. And trust me, the fallout will be more than you're prepared to handle. Carl scoffed, waving a dismissive hand toward the bystanders. Let them record. This is my park, and I don't take orders from you or anyone else. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. You should. Because when this is over, I'll be the one holding you accountable. The words hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy with meaning. Carl hesitated, glancing briefly at the onlookers, then back at Malcolm. He could feel the weight of the moment shifting, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Is that a threat? Carl sneered. It's a fact, Malcolm replied coldly. Before Carl could respond, another figure appeared from the edge of the crowd. It was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a business suit and holding her phone tightly. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and cutting through the tension. Officer Mason, that's enough, she said firmly. Carl turned to her, his expression flickering between irritation and surprise. And who the hell are you? Someone who knows exactly what's happening here, the woman replied, her gaze unwavering. She pointed to Malcolm. And someone who knows him. Malcolm's head tilted slightly, recognition dawning in his eyes. The woman was Jessica Turner, the Greenfield District Attorney. They'd crossed paths before, though not under circumstances like this. He hadn't expected her to intervene, but her presence was a welcome shift in the dynamic. Carl's bravado faltered. Look, I'm just doing my job, he said defensively. This guy was acting suspicious. Jessica interrupted, her tone incredulous. Sitting on a bench in a public park is suspicious to you? Or is it just suspicious when someone like him does it? The crowd murmured, emboldened by Jessica's words. Carl's face flushed, but he refused to back down. I don't need a lecture, lady, Carl snapped. I'm handling this. Handling it? Jessica stepped closer, her voice rising. You've crossed every line imaginable, and if you think this is going to blow over, you're sorely mistaken. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Carl blinked, his confidence finally cracking. His gaze flicked back to Malcolm, who stood silently, his expression unreadable. Malcolm didn't need to say anything, his presence alone was enough to make Carl question every decision that had led him to this moment. What, who is he? Carl stammered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Jessica's eyes narrowed. You'll find out soon enough. But let me give you some advice, Officer Mason. You might want to start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your superiors. And to the media. And to the lawyers who are undoubtedly going to be involved. Carl opened his mouth to argue but found himself at a loss. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Malcolm finally broke his silence. You wanted to know who I am, Officer Mason. His voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. You'll find out. And when you do, I hope you're ready to face the consequences. Carl's mouth worked, but no words came out. He looked from Malcolm to Jessica, then to the crowd, which was now buzzing with anticipation. The tide had turned, and Carl was standing on the wrong side of it. Malcolm turned to Jessica, his tone softening. Thank you for stepping in. Jessica nodded, her expression serious. This isn't over, Malcolm. Not by a long shot. I know, Malcolm said, his gaze shifting back to Carl. But it's just beginning for him. The chapter ends with the tension thick in the air, the crowd still murmuring, and Carl Mason standing frozen, his fate hanging in the balance. What will happen when the truth comes to light? What will Malcolm's next move be? And how will Carl face the reckoning that's barreling toward him? The answers are coming, and they're not what anyone expects. The atmosphere in the small interrogation room was oppressive, the air thick with tension and unspoken truths. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly, casting a cold, pale glow over the table that sat in the center of the room. On one side, Malcolm Gaines sat, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. Across from him was Officer Carl Mason, now stripped of his badge and uniform, his confidence reduced to nervous fidgeting. His eyes darted between Malcolm and the two-way mirror behind him, where he knew his colleagues, and maybe even his superiors, were watching. Carl's arrogance had been replaced with unease, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table. His breath was shallow, his mind racing to grasp the reality of the situation. The man he had dismissed, humiliated, and assaulted in the park was now seated across from him, not as a victim, but as an authority figure who held Carl's future in his hands. The door opened with a soft creak, and Jessica Turner, the district attorney, stepped inside. She carried a thick file in her hands and set it down on the table with a deliberate thud. Carl flinched at the sound. "Officer Mason," Jessica began, her voice sharp and professional, "thank you for joining us. Though, to be clear, you didn't have much of a choice." Carl sat back in his chair, trying to feign indifference. "What is this? Some kind of intimidation tactic?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice low but deliberate. "Call it an opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" Carl snapped, though his voice wavered. "To own up to what you've done," Malcolm replied, his tone steady. "Not just to me, but to everyone you've mistreated under the guise of protecting this community." Jessica slid the file across the table toward Carl. "These are the complaints filed against you over the past 8 years, she said. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. Should I go on?" Carl didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and he stared at the file as though it were a ticking bomb. "You've skated by for too long," Jessica continued. "Your department's lack of accountability has shielded you. But that ends today." Malcolm's gaze bore into Carl. "You thought you could treat people however you wanted because no one would push back. Because no one had the power to hold you accountable. That's why you punched me in the park without hesitation. You didn't see a man, you saw a target. Someone you thought wouldn't fight back." Carl's fists tightened on the table. "I was doing my job," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was gone. "Your job?" Malcolm's voice sharpened. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and assault people based on your own prejudices." Carl's face flushed, his defenses crumbling under the weight of their words. But Malcolm wasn't finished. "You want to know who I am, Carl?" Malcolm said, leaning closer. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I'm the person who spent the last decade investigating men like you. Men who abuse their power, who think they're untouchable because they wear a badge. And I'm damn good at my job." Carl's eyes widened slightly, the realization hitting him like a freight train. You were investigating me?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He let the silence linger, forcing Carl to sit with the weight of his own actions. Jessica stepped in, her tone clipped. "Your actions in the park gave us probable cause to dig deeper, Officer Mason. And what we found was illuminating." She opened the file and began laying out documents, reports, testimonies, photographs. Carl's breath hitched as he recognized some of the incidents, moments he'd thought had been buried or forgotten. "You see, Carl," Malcolm said, his voice softer now, almost pitying, "this isn't just about what happened in the park. That was the spark, but the fire has been burning for a long time. And now, there's nowhere for you to hide." Carl's composure shattered. He slammed his hands on the table, his voice rising. "This is a setup. You can't just dig into my life because of one incident." Jessica didn't flinch. "It's not a setup, Carl. It's justice. And it's long overdue." The room fell silent again, the weight of their words pressing down on Carl. He looked from Jessica to Malcolm, his face a mixture of anger and fear. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Carl spat at Malcolm. "Sitting there in your fancy suit, acting like you're better than me." Malcolm's expression didn't change. This isn't about being better. It's about doing what's right. Something you forgot a long time ago. Carl shook his head, his anger giving way to desperation. I've got a family, he said, his voice cracking. Kids who depend on me. If you do this, you'll ruin everything. Malcolm's gaze softened, but only slightly. And how many families have you ruined, Carl? How many lives have you disrupted because you couldn't see past your own prejudice? Carl didn't answer. He couldn't. Jessica spoke again, her tone firm. You have two choices, Carl. You can cooperate with this investigation, admit to your misconduct, and maybe, find some way to rebuild your life. Or you can fight this, and I guarantee you'll lose everything. Your job, your pension, your reputation, it's all on the line. Carl's shoulders slumped, the weight of the moment finally breaking him. He buried his face in his hands, his arrogance fully replaced by defeat. The silence in the room was deafening. Malcolm watched Carl carefully, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. Part of him wanted to see Carl crumble completely, to feel the full weight of what he'd done. But another part of him, the part that had spent years fighting for justice, knew that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that no one was above accountability. Jessica gathered the papers back into the file, her movements deliberate. Think carefully, Carl, she said. We'll be back in an hour. And when we return, I expect an answer. She stood, nodding to Malcolm, who followed her to the door. They left Carl alone in the room, the echo of the door closing behind them a final reminder of the walls closing in on him. As Malcolm walked down the hallway, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Satisfaction, anger, exhaustion, and a flicker of hope. Hope that this moment, this reckoning, would be the beginning of something bigger. The question lingering in the air, what decision will Carl make? Will he accept responsibility, or will he fight back against the inevitable? And what does this moment mean for Malcolm's journey, and the fight for justice in a system designed to protect people like Carl? The answer lies ahead, and it's one you won't see coming. The hour passed like a slow-moving storm, heavy with anticipation. Malcolm and Jessica sat in an observation room adjacent to the interrogation room, the two-way mirror giving them a clear view of Carl Mason. He hadn't moved much since they'd left him. His shoulders were hunched, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Jessica broke the silence. He's unraveling. Malcolm nodded, his eyes fixed on Carl. Good. He needs to. This isn't something he can talk his way out of. Jessica leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. People like Mason never think they'll face consequences. They're so used to the system protecting them that the idea of accountability feels foreign. Not anymore, Malcolm replied, his voice steady. Not this time. Jessica studied him for a moment. You're taking this personally. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Wouldn't you? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. In the room, Carl shifted uncomfortably, muttering to himself. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Let's go back in. Jessica hesitated. You sure? He's cornered. People do unpredictable things when they're desperate. That's exactly why we need to press him, Malcolm said, already heading toward the door. When they re-entered the interrogation room, Carl's head snapped up. His eyes darted between Malcolm and Jessica, panic flickering behind his forced bravado. You're back, Carl said, his voice hoarse. What, you think I've been sitting here scared out of my mind? Jessica raised an eyebrow. Haven't you? Carl tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous chuckle. I've been thinking, that's all. Thinking about how you two are trying to set me up. Malcolm sat down across from him, his movements deliberate. Set you up? Carl, you've done this to yourself. Carl scoffed. You don't know a damn thing about me. Oh, I know plenty, Malcolm said, his voice calm but edged with steel. I know about the complaints, the cover-ups, the people you've hurt. I know you've spent years abusing the badge you claim to respect. Carl's face darkened. You don't know what it's like to be a cop. To deal with the kind of crap we deal with every day. And that justifies what you've done. Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Carl's. You think your job is an excuse to dehumanize people? To punch a man sitting on a park bench because you didn't like the way he looked? Carl's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked away, his gaze falling to the table. Jessica jumped in, her tone sharp. This isn't about the pressures of your job, Mason. This is about power, power you've abused over and over again. You think you're the victim here? You're not. Carl's head snapped up. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to be stuck in some backwater suburb dealing with the same nonsense day after day? You have no idea what it's like. Then tell us, Malcolm said, his voice softening just slightly. Help us understand, Carl. Because right now, all I see is a man who let his anger and prejudice destroy his career. Carl hesitated, his defenses wavering. For a moment, it seemed like he might open up, but then his expression hardened again. This is a waste of time, Carl muttered. You've already decided what you want to do with me. Jessica folded her arms. You're right, Mason. We have. But what happens next depends on you. Carl's laugh was bitter. You want me to grovel? Beg for forgiveness? Is that it? No, Malcolm said quietly. We want the truth. Carl looked at him, his eyes narrowing. The truth? You want to know the truth? Fine. I hate this job. I hate dealing with people who don't respect the law, who treat us like the enemy. And that justifies what you did to me? Malcolm asked, his voice rising slightly. Does that justify punching me in the face in front of a park full of people? Does it justify every other person you've hurt over the years? Carl's voice cracked as he shouted back, I didn't mean for it to go this far. The words hung in the air, raw and desperate. Carl slumped back in his chair, his hands covering his face. I didn't mean for any of it, he muttered, his voice barely audible. But once you start, it's hard to stop. The anger, the frustration, it just builds. Malcolm leaned back, his expression unreadable. So, what now? You expect sympathy? Understanding? Carl didn't respond. He stared at the table, his silence saying more than words ever could. Jessica exchanged a glance with Malcolm before speaking again. Carl, this is your chance to take responsibility. You can either cooperate with this investigation, or you can let us proceed without your input. But make no mistake, we will proceed. Carl's hands clenched into fists. And what happens to me? Huh? You'll ruin my life, my family, your actions ruined your life, Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm. Don't put that on us. Carl's head dropped, his shoulders shaking slightly. It was unclear whether he was crying or simply overwhelmed. Either way, the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. Malcolm watched him for a long moment before standing. We're done here. Jessica nodded and began gathering the files. As they turned to leave, Carl's voice stopped them. Wait. Malcolm paused, glancing back over his shoulder. What is it, Carl? Carl hesitated, his voice trembling. If I cooperate, what happens to my family? Malcolm's expression softened just slightly. That depends on you. But if you think staying silent is going to protect them, you're wrong. The truth will come out, one way or another. Carl nodded slowly, his eyes glassy. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the full scope of what was at stake. Malcolm turned back toward the door. We'll give you a few more minutes to think it over. But remember, Carl, this is your last chance to do the right thing. The door closed behind them, leaving Carl alone in the suffocating silence of the interrogation room. The tension in this first half leaves Carl Mason at a crossroads, his fate hanging by a thread. Stay tuned for the continuation of this climactic confrontation. The silence in the observation room was thick as Malcolm and Jessica watched Carl through the two-way mirror. His head was buried in his hands, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his predicament. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he turned to Jessica. "He's close," Malcolm said. "But he's still clinging to the idea that he can come out of this unscathed." Jessica nodded. "He needs to understand that there's no walking away clean. He can't just undo years of harm with a single confession." Malcolm's expression hardened. "No, but he can start by acknowledging it. If we push him too hard, he'll shut down. But if we don't push enough, he'll retreat into denial." Jessica considered this, then motioned toward the door. "Let's go back in." When they entered the interrogation room again, Carl didn't look up. His fingers were laced together tightly, his knuckles white. He flinched slightly as the door closed, but he didn't speak. Jessica was the first to break the silence. "Carl, we need a decision. Sitting here in silence won't change what's coming." Carl finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "You want me to confess? Fine. I'll admit I've made mistakes. But you don't understand what it's like out there. People don't respect us. They treat us like we're the enemy." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Respect is earned, Carl. And you haven't exactly done much to earn it." Carl's jaw tightened. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to put on this uniform every day, not knowing if you'll make it home." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You're right. I don't wear your uniform. But I do know what it's like to walk into situations where your life is on the line. I've been undercover in some of the most dangerous places in this country. I've faced people who wanted me dead simply because of what I represent. So don't tell me I don't understand fear, Carl. I live with it every day." Carl blinked, caught off guard by Malcolm's words. For a moment, he seemed to consider them, but then his defenses went back up. "You think you're better than me? Because you've got a fancy badge and a suit?" "This isn't about who's better," Malcolm shot back. "It's about accountability. You can't hide behind your fear anymore, Carl. You let it consume you, and now you're using it as an excuse for your actions. But fear doesn't justify hatred. It doesn't justify abuse." Jessica chimed in, her tone sharp. "And it sure as hell doesn't justify what you did in that park. You didn't see Malcolm as a man. You saw him as a threat because of your own biases. Admit it." Carl's hands clenched into fists on the table. His lips trembled as if he were holding back a torrent of emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hit him," Carl said. I lost control." Malcolm's expression didn't soften. "And what about all the others, Carl? Was that just losing control, too? Or is that how you've dealt with anyone who challenges your authority?" Carl's eyes darted to Malcolm, then back to the table. He didn't answer. Jessica pressed on. "We've got the records, Carl. The complaints, the testimonies. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern." I didn't mean for it to become a pattern," Carl muttered. His voice cracked, and he rubbed his hands over his face. Damn it, I don't know anymore." Malcolm leaned back, his tone softening slightly. "Then figure it out. Because until you do, you'll keep blaming everyone else for your mistakes. And that's not going to save you." Carl let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "What happens if I cooperate?" Jessica exchanged a glance with Malcolm before answering. "You'll face charges. You'll likely lose your job, your pension. But if you're honest, fully honest, we might be able to recommend leniency. It won't erase what you've done, but it'll show that you're at least willing to take responsibility. Carl shook his head, his voice trembling. I can't lose everything. Malcolm's gaze hardened. You already have, Carl. You just haven't realized it yet. The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. He looked up at Malcolm, his eyes filled with desperation. What do you want from me? The truth, Malcolm said simply. Not just about what happened in the park, but about everything. The people you've hurt, the lines you've crossed. All of it. Carl hesitated, his gaze shifting to the two-way mirror. They're watching, aren't they? My colleagues. Yes, Jessica said bluntly. And so is the rest of the world. The moment you assaulted Malcolm in that park, your actions became public. You're not just accountable to us, Carl. You're accountable to everyone. Carl swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to compose himself. Fine, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything. Malcolm nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. Then let's start at the beginning. As Carl began to recount his history of misconduct, the weight of his actions seemed to settle on him like a physical burden. His voice trembled as he spoke, each word a painful admission of guilt. Malcolm and Jessica listened intently, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and somber understanding. For Malcolm, this wasn't just about justice, it was about setting a precedent. Carl Mason wasn't the first officer to abuse his power, and he wouldn't be the last. But this moment was a step toward accountability, a reminder that even those who wield authority must answer for their actions. The chapter ended with Carl's voice fading into the background, his confessions filling the room. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, his resolve unshaken. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of a larger fight for change. And that fight was far from over. The silence in the room was deafening as Carl Mason's words trailed off, his confessions laid bare on the table. The man who had once towered with arrogance now sat slumped, deflated, and visibly shaken. His voice had grown hoarse, the weight of his admission stripping away whatever semblance of control he thought he had left. Jessica Turner closed her notebook with a definitive snap, her face unreadable as she glanced at Malcolm. He hadn't moved much throughout Carl's confession, his posture steady, his eyes focused like a hawk observing its prey. But beneath his calm exterior, Malcolm felt the tension of the moment coursing through him. This wasn't just about Carl anymore, it was about what came next. Jessica broke the silence. Carl, your cooperation today has been noted. But let's be clear. This doesn't erase what you've done. It's a step in the right direction, but the road ahead is going to be long and difficult. Carl looked up, his face pale. What happens now? Jessica leaned forward, her tone firm. We've got enough evidence to move forward with charges against you. Your testimony will be included in the case, but it's ultimately up to the court to decide your fate. Carl's eyes darted between Jessica and Malcolm, his panic evident. You said there'd be leniency if I cooperated. I said it would be considered, Jessica corrected. But leniency doesn't mean a free pass, Carl. There are consequences for your actions. Carl let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. What about my family? My wife, my kids, what am I supposed to tell them? Malcolm's voice cut through the air like a blade. Tell them the truth. Carl turned to him, his expression raw with desperation. You think that's easy? To tell my kids that their dad's a failure? That he's about to lose everything because he couldn't control his temper? No, Malcolm replied, his tone unyielding. It's not easy. But it's the truth. And if you're serious about changing, that's where it starts. The room fell silent again, the weight of the conversation pressing down on all three of them. Carl's gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping even further. Jessica stood, gathering her papers. This part is done, Carl. But your journey is just beginning. You'll be hearing from us soon. As she moved toward the door, she paused, glancing back at Malcolm. You coming? Malcolm shook his head. I need a minute. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. Don't take too long. She stepped out, leaving Malcolm and Carl alone in the room. The air between them was heavy, the unspoken tension palpable. Carl finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you press charges immediately? You could have had me arrested on the spot. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. Because this isn't just about you, Carl. This is about the system that let you get away with this for years. Arresting you in the park wouldn't have solved anything. But making you face what you've done. That's a start. Carl's lips trembled as he tried to formulate a response. I didn't think it would end like this. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice low but firm. That's the problem, Carl. You never thought. Not about the people you hurt, not about the lives you disrupted. You only thought about your own power, your own control. Carl swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you think I can fix this? Do you think it's too late for me? Malcolm's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained steady. It's not too late to try. But fixing this? That's not up to me. That's up to you. Carl nodded slowly, the weight of Malcolm's words settling over him like a shroud. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the enormity of his actions, and the path he would need to take to make amends. Outside the interrogation room, Jessica was waiting in the hallway, her arms crossed as she watched Malcolm step out. Her sharp eyes studied him for a moment before she spoke. You okay? She asked. Malcolm gave a small nod. I'll be fine. Just needed to let him sit with it for a bit. Jessica raised an eyebrow. You think he'll follow through? Actually take responsibility for his actions? Malcolm shrugged. I don't know. But at least now, he doesn't have a choice but to face the truth. Jessica sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I'll admit, I didn't think we'd get this far. Men like Mason rarely crack, let alone confess. That's because no one's ever forced them to, Malcolm said. His tone carried a hint of exhaustion, the weight of the day starting to settle on him. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Jessica nodded, her expression serious. You're right. The trial, the public fallout, this is just the beginning. And if we're going to make this stick, we'll need to be ready for the backlash. Malcolm gave her a small, determined smile. I've been ready for a long time. Jessica's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Looks like the department's already issued a statement about Mason's suspension. The media's going to have a field day with this. Malcolm chuckled dryly. Good. Maybe some public scrutiny will finally force them to clean house. Jessica's gaze softened slightly. You did good today, Malcolm. I know this wasn't easy. Malcolm's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. It wasn't about being easy. It was about doing what's right. Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie. Let's hope this sets a precedent. As Jessica walked away, Malcolm lingered in the hallway, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, but today had been a step in the right direction. He pulled out his phone and opened a text thread with his daughter, Simone. The last message was from her, asking when he'd be home. Malcolm typed a quick response, soon. Dad's got a lot to tell you. He hit send and pocketed his phone, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For all the darkness he'd faced today, the thought of Simone brought a glimmer of hope. As he walked out of the precinct, the cool evening air hit his face, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. This was just the beginning of Carl Mason's reckoning, of the systemic change that Malcolm had spent his career fighting for, and of a future that, despite everything, still held the promise of justice. But for Malcolm, the real battle was far from over. And he was ready for it. Malcolm walked into his modest apartment just after dusk, the weight of the day still pressing on his shoulders. The quiet hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the intensity of the interrogation room. As he hung his jacket by the door, he heard the familiar sound of Simone's laughter. It was soft, melodic, and a much-needed balm for his frayed nerves. "Dad!" Simone called out, appearing in the hallway. Her dark curls bounced as she ran toward him, her arms open wide. At 9 years old, Simone was Malcolm's anchor, a reminder of why he fought so hard to make the world a better place. Malcolm crouched, catching her in a hug. "Hey, baby girl. How was your day?" "It was good," she said, pulling back to look at him. Her wide eyes sparkled with curiosity. "We had a project at school about heroes, and I told everyone my dad works for the FBI." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Oh yeah? What did your teacher say?" "She said I'm lucky to have a hero for a dad," Simone said, beaming. Then her expression turned serious. "But Dad, are you okay? You look tired." Malcolm chuckled softly. "It was a long day, but I'm okay. How about we talk more over dinner? I want to hear all about your hero project." Simone nodded eagerly, skipping off to set the table. Malcolm followed her, his chest tightening as he thought about the kind of world Simone was growing up in. He wanted to believe that the work he'd done today would help build a future where she wouldn't have to face the same struggles he had. Later that night, Malcolm sat on the edge of his bed, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. News of Carl Mason's suspension and impending charges had spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with debates, the responses ranging from outrage to praise. Jessica's name popped up on his screen, and he answered immediately. "Hey," she said, her tone brisk. "Have you seen the news?" "Hard to miss," Malcolm replied. "Seems like everyone's got an opinion." Jessica sighed. "Yeah, and not all of them are helpful. Mason's lawyer just released a statement claiming the department is scapegoating him." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Scapegoating?" The man confessed. He admitted to everything. "You know how this works," Jessica said. "They're trying to control the narrative. Make him out to be the victim of a system that failed to support him. It's a classic move." Malcolm rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "So, what's our next step?" "We stay the course," Jessica said firmly. "The evidence is solid. His confession is on record. This isn't about public opinion, it's about making sure justice is served." Malcolm nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do." "Will do," Jessica said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "You did good today, Malcolm. Try to get some rest." "I'll try," he said, though he doubted he'd be able to. As the call ended, Malcolm stared at his phone, the notifications continuing to pour in. He knew this was far from over. The following morning, Malcolm found himself back at the precinct. The tension in the air was palpable as officers bustled about, their conversations hushed. He noticed a few sideways glances in his direction, expressions ranging from curiosity to resentment. Jessica met him in the hallway, a file in her hands and a determined look on her face. "We've got more," she said without preamble, handing him the file. Malcolm opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. More complaints. More testimonies. The scope of Carl Mason's misconduct was even broader than they'd initially realized. "This isn't just about Mason," Jessica said. "This is about a culture that allowed him to operate unchecked for years." Malcolm nodded, his mind racing. "We need to expose this. Not just Mason, but the entire system that protected him." Jessica's expression was grim. That's not going to be easy. There are a lot of people who won't want this to come out. Let them try to stop us, Malcolm said, his voice firm. We've come too far to back down now. Jessica gave him a small, approving nod. Then let's get to work. As the day wore on, Malcolm and Jessica combed through the evidence, their determination unwavering. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, patterns of abuse, systemic failures, and a troubling lack of accountability within the department. It was a tangled web, but Malcolm was no stranger to untangling the truth. Hours later, Malcolm found himself in yet another meeting, this time with the precinct's chief of police. Chief Harris was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression that betrayed little of what he was thinking. Agent Gaines, Harris began, his tone measured. I understand you've been working closely with the district attorney on this case. That's correct, Malcolm said, meeting the chief's gaze without flinching. Harris folded his hands on the desk. I want to be clear, I support accountability. Officers who violate the public's trust have no place in this department. Malcolm nodded, sensing a "but" coming. However, Harris continued, this situation is complicated. Public trust in law enforcement is already fragile. If this investigation isn't handled carefully, it could have unintended consequences. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. With all due respect, Chief, the consequences we're dealing with now are the result of years of inaction. Sweeping this under the rug won't fix anything, it'll only make it worse. Harris's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I'm not suggesting we sweep anything under the rug, Agent Gaines. I'm saying we need to be strategic. Strategic doesn't mean avoiding the truth, Malcolm said firmly. The public deserves to know what's been happening. And the officers who've been complicit in this culture need to be held accountable. Harris studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. You've got my support. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. Malcolm stood, his resolve unshaken. I've been ready. As the day drew to a close, Malcolm found himself once again reflecting on the events of the past 48 hours. The fight for justice was far from over, but progress was being made. Carl Mason was no longer a symbol of unchecked power, he was a warning of what happens when accountability catches up. Malcolm sat down at his desk, pulling out a notebook. He jotted down notes, ideas, and reflections, his pen moving steadily across the page. For him, this wasn't just about one man, it was about creating a system that valued integrity over power, justice over fear. The weight of the day still lingered, but for the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. And that made the fight worth it. He glanced at a photo on his desk, a picture of him and Simone at her last birthday party. Her smile was bright, full of innocence and joy. Malcolm promised himself he would do everything in his power to protect that smile, to ensure she grew up in a world that was just a little bit better than the one he'd known. As he turned off the desk lamp and prepared to head home, Malcolm knew the battle wasn't over. But he also knew he wasn't fighting it alone. And for now, that was enough. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Carl Mason sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and his shoulders hunched. His once commanding presence had crumbled over the weeks leading to this moment. The testimonies, the evidence, the public scrutiny, it had all stripped him of the power he once wielded so carelessly. On the other side of the room, Malcolm Gaines sat in the audience, his expression calm but unyielding. He hadn't needed to testify, the mountain of evidence against Carl had been enough. But Malcolm had been there for every hearing, every motion, every painstaking moment of the trial. He wasn't just seeking justice for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had been hurt by Carl's unchecked authority. The judge's voice broke the silence. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony, this court finds the defendant, Carl Mason, guilty on multiple counts, including assault, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Carl's head dropped, his hands clenched into fists. He looked over at his lawyer, who offered no solace. The system Carl had once relied on to protect him had finally turned against him. The judge continued. Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks, but let this serve as a reminder that those entrusted with power are not above the law. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he allowed himself a small nod. Justice, while imperfect, had been served. Later that evening, Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, the cool night air brushing against his face. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing as they called out questions to anyone who passed. Malcolm had already given his statement, choosing his words carefully to focus on accountability and change rather than personal vengeance. Jessica Turner joined him on the steps, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "You did good, Malcolm." "We did good," he corrected, giving her a faint smile. This was a team effort. Jessica nodded, her gaze shifting to the reporters below. "You think it'll stick?" "The changes, I mean." "It has to," Malcolm said firmly. "People are paying attention now. This isn't something they can sweep under the rug." Jessica exhaled slowly. "I hope you're right. The system doesn't change overnight." "No," Malcolm agreed. But today was a start. For Carl Mason, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. In addition to his criminal convictions, he was stripped of his badge and pension. His name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when power is abused. In the weeks that followed, Carl made several attempts to speak publicly, to justify his actions, but his words rang hollow. The public wasn't interested in excuses, they wanted accountability. Left with little else, Carl retreated into obscurity. His family, though shaken, began to rebuild their lives without him. The man who had once terrorized his community now faced the stark reality of his own isolation. It wasn't vengeance, it was justice. For Malcolm, the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a new chapter. He became a leading voice in advocating for police reform, using his platform to push for systemic changes. His calm, measured approach earned him respect on all sides, even among those initially resistant to change. Malcolm wasn't just fighting for accountability, he was fighting for a future where stories like his wouldn't have to happen. One evening, Malcolm was invited to speak at a community event in Greenfield. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, activists, officers, local leaders, and families. As Malcolm stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "I'm here tonight," Malcolm began, "not because of what happened to me, but because of what that moment represents. It's easy to think of justice as a single act, a verdict, or a headline. But justice is a process. It's accountability, yes, but it's also about healing, about rebuilding trust, and about making sure no one has to endure the same pain again." The room erupted in applause, but Malcolm wasn't finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice steady. "We have a choice," he said. "We can let fear and prejudice dictate our actions, or we can choose to be better. Not perfect, but better. For ourselves, for our families, and for the generations to come." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing in the hall. Malcolm stepped back, letting the moment sink in. He wasn't just speaking to them, he was speaking to a part of himself, the part that had carried the weight of injustice for too long. Back at home, Malcolm found Simone waiting for him on the couch, her face lighting up as he walked in. "How was the event, Dad?" "It went well," Malcolm said, ruffling her curls as he sat beside her. "But I think the best part of my day is being here with you." Simone giggled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're my hero, Dad." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling. "And you're mine, kiddo." For Malcolm, the fight wasn't over. But in moments like these, he was reminded of why it mattered. Change was slow, sometimes painful, but it was worth every step. This story is more than just a tale of justice, it's a mirror reflecting the struggles many face every day. It's about accountability, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Malcolm's journey reminds us that while the path to justice is never easy, it's one we must walk together. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for yourself or someone else? How did it shape you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your stories. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Here, we bring you powerful stories of transformation, justice, and hope. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and join us for more narratives that challenge and inspire. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.